Nina is a DC-based writer. She's based primarily at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She's had an affiliation with the Kennan Institute there, which is the institute that focuses on Russia. She is now, however, with the Science, Technology, and Innovation program at the center, and it's an honor to have her here today, because the Wilson Center is close to my heart. It's a wonderful institution, and in saying that, I'm completely biased because I used to work there and I just love the place. So I'm very excited to have somebody from the center here. She was a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellow, and under that program, she provided strategic communications to Ukraine. She's a prolific writer. She's been in the New York Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, Foreign Affairs. Just this week, she has been, I think, on CNN, a podcast on CNN. She's, of course, had the launch for her book at the Wilson Center. Just this morning, I caught a bit of it at midnight Australian time, or 12:30 or so. She was at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, another very well-known think tank in the United States. I think she's got appointments coming up at Chatham House, with BuzzFeed, with various institutions, but we're very pleased that she's agreed to make the Australian Institute of International Affairs one of the first points of call. I think it's the first foreign one you've done, maybe?
That is true, yes, all the way in Australia. Right. I'm very happy to be with you.
She's also a graduate of the Walsh Foreign Policy School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and she's a fluent speaker, as I understand it, of Russian, and proficient as well in Polish and Ukrainian. So, again, we are extremely pleased to have you here, and I'll now turn things over to you for your presentation, Nina.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with you, and I have been really interested to learn more about the Australian information environment, thanks to a few of my Twitter friends. So shout out to you guys if you're in the audience today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And presenting my PowerPoint, which is loosely about my book, but it also includes some more updated information about basically the information environment that we're heading into ahead of the US 2020 election. A lot of the same trends are visible around the rest of the world, and most of them started in Ukraine, which I'll talk about a little bit as we get into it here. So just a little bit more about me. Bryce gave a lovely introduction, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about the research program that I'm leading at the Wilson Center. Our motto at the Wilson Center is knowledge in the public interest. So yes, we do a lot of wonky policy development and analysis, but I'm particularly interested with my portfolio around disinformation in awareness raising within the general public. And I think you'll understand as I kind of give my soapbox spiel here why that is. But I really believe in citizens-based solutions to disinformation. I believe we need to look at the root causes of the problem in order to solve it. And so far, we've not made those investments. So that's part of what I try to do in my work at the Wilson Center. I also do a lot of congressional testimonies and briefings, which is part and parcel of what the Wilson Center does, as well as all the media engagement that's already been covered. One of the programs that I have been really excited to run over the past couple of months, although it seems like a different time now when we could all still travel, was related to educating members of parliaments and members of Congress on disinformation, a cross-border program where we brought in MPs from 5 countries and had them meet with staff on Capitol Hill here in Washington. And we showed them ways to combat disinformation, whether it's attacking their office or a campaign that they're involved in, and tried to drive home the point that this is a democratic small d problem, not a partisan issue, that it can affect anyone, that there's no scruples when it comes to disinformation. And I'll get into a little bit of that later why that is. But I think that's a really important point to drive home, also backed up by my research. And soon we'll have a paper about comparative approaches to social media regulation coming out, which is probably sounds pretty wonky, but I actually think will be fairly instructive as many nations in the West are starting to think about how to combat disinformation in their regulatory structures. There's a couple of early adopters, we could say, that have taken radically different paths, some more democratic and human rights based than others. And so that is what that paper will look at. And if all goes well, it will be out by the end of the summer. So you can keep an eye out about that. And of course, I have my book, which I'm here to talk about today. I love this this GIF, not only because I own a ginger cat myself. Unfortunately, this is not him, but I was thinking today I should try to recreate this with him. But I often talk about the fact that our response to disinformation so far, the West, or the social media platforms, whatever you want to call it, has been very much like playing a game of whack-a-troll, very similar to the carnival game of whack-a-mole. Often I take this presentation to non-English speaking countries, and I need a way to illustrate that. So that's where this cat comes in, but who doesn't like a fun, cute cat? But basically, you know, so far we have been focused on removing fake accounts, removing, you know, inauthentic content. A lot of the debate around social media regulation is focused on content moderation. And I argue, as I've already alluded to, that it's part of the solution, but it is not the entire solution. And we need to think much more broadly and much closer to home when we think about solving the disinformation problem, whether it's coming from Russia or whether it's domestic disinformation that we are talking about. I always like to define terms at the start of my presentation because I found that even among very, very smart people and among reputable media outlets, there is a tendency to confuse things. So just at the start, disinformation is false or misleading information spread with malign intent. Misinformation is false or misleading information spread without that malign intent. So when your crazy aunt or uncle is spreading conspiracy theories on Facebook, that's probably misinformation. If those things are coming to you from a Russian or Chinese troll, that's disinformation, right? They have an intent behind it. And just to make things a little bit more complicated, I don't have it up here, but malinformation is a great term as well. That refers to hack and leak operations. So things like when the DNC was hacked and its emails were made public, all of that information that is true, often private information, made public again with malign intent, that is malinformation. This, of course, is different than propaganda, which is information spread to persuade an audience, but usually with a political connotation or on behalf of a government. So that's what the Soviet Union used to do, and I'll talk a little bit more about why its strategy, the Russian strategy of disinformation, is very different from that. These days, there isn't necessarily a political purpose other than to undermine the democratic system writ large. In fact, we've seen Russia kind of agitate on both sides of the political debate in a number of countries. So again, there's not that kind of propping up of the communist or now the Russian Federation, the Kremlin regime. Often trolls and bots are mixed up in our discourse. So a troll is an account that has a real human being behind it. Sometimes one human can control multiple accounts, but again, there's a human person behind it. They're logging in and out of those accounts, posting messages from them. Sometimes those are inflammatory messages. Sometimes it's just astroturfing to kind of give the guise of grassroots support for a movement or an idea online. But a bot is a social media account that is operated entirely by a computer program. So recently in Ukraine, there was a discovery of a bot farm that was almost certainly run by Russia. It had, I think, something like 40,000 different SIM cards that were used because you often need a phone number to confirm a social media account these days. And there were servers spread out over 12 cities in Ukraine. Again, these are automated accounts that do not have a human being behind them. And that is the difference between a bot and a troll. They are not interchangeable terms. The most important misconception, though, I think that especially here in the United States, we tend to overlook in our discussion of disinformation is that disinformation is exploiting our kind of natural born mistrust of certain institutions, and it is manipulating our emotions. I think because of the shorthand of quote unquote fake news, we often think about disinformation as something that's just about cut and dry fakes, whether it's a manipulated image or a fake news article that was posted on a disreputable website. It's actually much more complicated than that. And I like to say that disinformation, the most successful disinformation, often has not only a kernel of truth to it, it's often a very convincing, visceral, emotional narrative that preys on people's, again, natural grievances that they might have in their society. And I'll expand on this in a little bit, but I just love this graph from the Edelman Trust Barometer in 2018, which shows declining trust in many of the nations that have some of the biggest problems with disinformation. There, of course, polls are, especially polling something like trust is a bit difficult, but I think it's quite interesting to see the decline in trust, especially in the United States from 2017 to 2018. And it's not surprising that Brazil is also on this graph. So the influence playbook, how does this work, especially with Russian disinformation? Again, the most, I think, often talked about part of the influence playbook is the use of bot and troll armies to amplify misleading or false messages. But it also exists offline. Influence operations are not just about online disinformation. They work in concert with the use of government organized NGOs or front organizations, as well as fake experts that lend credence to the narratives that bot and troll armies are amplifying. Of course, we have cyber attacks and cyber crime, which inform malinformation. I would say that that was probably the most successful of the tactics used in the 2016 election. And then we also have the funding and organizing of protests and political parties, which I know is of a special concern to Australia with regard to Chinese influence. Russia has done the same thing in Germany. There was also a case study in my book, which an excerpt of this was published in Politico magazine about 10 days ago, which explains how Russia used online advertising to, I wouldn't say foment a protest, but to amplify an anti-Trump protest in July of 2017 on Independence Day in front of the White House. They bought some ads to draw people to an anti-Trump protest where people were singing songs from the musical Les Miserables with, updated lyrics about Trump, demanding impeachment. And again, that just goes to show not only that Russia foments protests or amplifies protests, but that they organize on all sides of the political spectrum. And they also use homegrown actors as their conduits very frequently. But what is Russia's goal in all of this? I said I'd get back to this. Here we are. I think Russia's goal in its disinformation activities is twofold. One, it is to pump up Russia's status as a world power. We know that Putin views the fall of the Soviet Union as one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. He is trying to get Russia back to the status it had during that great power competition during the Soviet period. And I would say in that regard, he's certainly been successful. Russia during the Obama administration was referred to as a regional power. Often we would go weeks, if not months, without hearing major news out of Russia, unless you're a Russia watcher like me. And I remember the days, when I was going into graduate school and people were asking me why I was studying Russia because Russia didn't matter anymore. Well, I think Russia has proven all of them wrong. Unfortunately for democratic societies, there really hasn't been a day since 2016 where we haven't spoken about what is going on, not only in Russia, but with regard to Russian foreign policy toward the United States. So that is the first goal. The second goal, of course, is to undermine the democratic systems that Russia views as a threat, not only to its power structure, but to its place in the world. And unfortunately, we are seeing that democratic degradation kind of continue apace over the past six or so years in Europe and here in the United States. It is, again, seizing on real grievances in society to inspire distrust and dismay and discontent. And ultimately, through all of those vectors, through that influence of our democratic discourse, to try to get us to not participate in democracy. And democracy runs on participation. It runs on us going to the voting booth, It runs on protest and all of that engagement. And when people are too tired of the constant information stream that is contradictory and very polarized, they're going to pull back and they're going to be less involved. And of course, that's a great thing for Russia to point to. Not only is the discord good for Russia to point to its own citizens, but that lack of engagement is great for Russia to point to as well, to say to its citizens, not only do they have, civil unrest in the United States or in Great Britain right now, they also, don't have a functioning democratic system. Look at turnout, look at this, look at that, look at the corruption of the system. All of that fuels Russia's whataboutism and strengthens its power structures at home as well. Now, of course, social media are extremely important in this entire equation. They are the vector through which Russia is really able to deliver its messaging in a very precise way. Because of the way social media platforms work, it's not just that information is traveling faster and farther than it would in the Soviet period, it is able to be targeted at a very minute level. So because of not only the advertising structures, but just the way that the algorithms work and feed on emotions, which we know disinformation is running on, Russia or any other bad actor, foreign or domestic, is able to target exactly the people the disinformation narratives are going to be most vulnerable to. So I like to say that disinformation has become democratized. It's not something that costs very much. All you really need is a social media account and a credit card. And even without the credit card, you can do a lot of serious damage if you seed narratives in the right places. And a little bit later, I'll talk about groups and the threat that they pose to democratic discourse. But basically, if you're savvy and you know some basic PR tricks that are available to any advertiser, or company that is looking to gain traction on social media, you can also influence the conversation. And unfortunately, social media platforms are cashing in on that. They're cashing in on our outrage and cashing in on that engagement. And we've seen some progress in pushing back against foreign interference. There was just a major takedown last week. But unfortunately, it has been too little too late, in my opinion, and I'm happy to answer your questions about that, but it gets very thorny very quickly, so I didn't want to make the entire presentation about that. But the targeting issue is the most important one when we're talking about the role that social media play in disseminating and amplifying disinformation. So now I figured I'd get into my case studies from my book. Basically, I wrote this book because I was living and working in Ukraine in 2016 and 2017 on the front lines of the information war, as we say, advising the foreign ministry on strategic communications and counter disinformation work as part of my Fulbright. And I was in Ukraine as the 2016 election happened. And it became very clear to me as the revelations about Russian foreign interference came to light that the West really had not been listening to our allies in Central and Eastern Europe over the past decade plus. And that begins with Estonia in 2007. You're all probably familiar with the cyber attacks that took place as part of the Bronze Soldier crisis in 2007. But there was also what I like to call beta trolls, beta disinformation happening in 2007 in Estonia. So the Cliff Notes version, basically this statue, this very handsome man on the left here, was a statue to Soviet war dead that were it was in the center of Tallinn, a very sleepy small town. Of course, Estonia has 1.2, 1.3 million citizens tops. 30%-ish of the population after the fall of the Soviet Union were ethnic Russians who essentially were disenfranchised by the newly democratic Estonian government because they didn't speak Estonian and couldn't pass a citizenship test. They were afforded a lot fewer economic opportunities, educational opportunities, and many of them didn't even hold Estonian passports. They had what were called gray passports, so not a citizen of Estonia, not a citizen of the Russian Federation, but able to travel between the two and often able to get Schengen visas as well. However, second-class citizens in many rights. And after Putin gave his famous speech in Munich in 2007, we saw this interesting kind of pushback in Estonia happening, pushback against Western influence. Estonia was now, of course, part of NATO and the European Union. And all of this was around the flashpoint of this statue. using kind of historical narratives about pushback against, the Soviet victory in World War II, Russia was able to kind of make this statue a flashpoint for nationalist, Estonian nationalists versus kind of Soviet, what's the word I'm looking for? Folks who are looking after, it's late here, sorry, 8 p.m. is not my normal high functioning brain time. But anyway, folks who are nostalgic, there we go, for the Soviet Union. And this became a point of protest and a point of clash for these two groups. And Russia was fueling that through its Russian language media, also through some covert actors, through the intelligence agencies and the Russian embassy there. And this all came to a head when the Estonian government decided to relocate this statue from the center of Tallinn to a military cemetery, as well as the war dead that were buried underneath it. Of course, these protests came to a head. The cyber attack from Russia targeted, Russian, Estonian media, government services, banking. And this was a real watershed moment for the Estonian government. It didn't really happen right away, but gradually we saw the Estonian government start to realize they needed to solve this problem at its root cause, which was integration of the Russian population, so that these fissures, these pre-existing, very kind of understandable fissures in society, couldn't be exploited not only by Russia, but by domestic actors who might be trying to cause that sort of trouble as well. And especially after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, we saw the Estonian government really double down on integration, education, Russian language media, all these sorts of things in order to kind of pursue further integration of the Russian population. And so far, this has been fairly successful. If you look at some of the polling data that the Ministry of Culture in Estonia runs, more and more ethnic Russians are taking on an Estonian identity for themselves. And they've done some really interesting things in addition to, creating a Russian language, Estonian sponsored media to compete with the state media that's being broadcast over the border. They've also invested in kind of outreach activities. So the presidential administration of Estonia has taken kind of a little sabbatical to the city of Narva, where many Russians live. These are really interesting investments that are, of course, a lot easier for a small nation like Estonia to do, but I don't think that means that Western nations shouldn't think along the same lines with the fissures that are being exploited in our societies as well. And the Czech Republic is a really interesting example. I also look at Georgia, Poland in the book, but we don't have time to go through everything today. So if you're interested in learning more about them, I suggest you pick up a copy. But the Czech Republic is of particular interest to me as kind of a policy analyst, because they were the first nation that created their own domestic unilateral counter-disinformation unit. And they did this in response to a real rise in anti-EU, anti-migrant feelings in the Czech Republic that were being exploited by disinformers. And in the Czech Republic, that looked like Czech websites that are almost certainly controlled by shadowy Russian forces. We've not been able to kind of make that connection and pinpoint where the money is coming from, but the indications are that it is coming from Russia. A few of these websites are kind of stoking these feelings, these anti-migrant feelings, anti-EU feelings, despite the fact that during the migrant crisis, the Czech Republic did not take any migrants. There were all sorts of rumors floating around about how because of migrants in Czech schools, they weren't going to be able to serve pork, which is blasphemy in the Czech Republic. And as a result, the Ministry of Interior decided, we really need to do something about this anti-migrant sentiment and respond to this in a democratic way. We're going to create a Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats, which was, again, housed in the Ministry of Interior, because of people's concern about terrorism related to Islamic terrorism. That's why that terrorism kind of moniker is in there, but they were also there to respond to disinformation. And basically, in addition to surveying the security situation related to hybrid threats and terrorism, they also did some fact checking related to the Interior Ministry's mandate, specifically related to immigration issues. And unfortunately, because of the kind of strong commitment to freedom of speech in the Czech Republic, and the fact that the Czech president often himself spreads disinformation about migrants, the center fell under criticism from the president, who said that they were going to have a button to turn off the internet, and there is widespread outrage from the public that, you know, there would suddenly be a censor in the Czech Republic. Of course, this wasn't what the center set out to do, but it's just interesting, especially and instructive for the United States, to look at a case like this where there is, you know, a policy response that is unable to really carry out its mandate because of criticism from within the government itself. And what's happened since the center's inception in 2017, they've basically focused inward. They do very, very few public fact checks, and I would say that's a good thing. I don't think the government should be involved in fact checking, but they've done a lot of training for public servants, and this is something that I think is, you know, definitely something Western governments can emulate as well. But a lesson here is that, you know, especially when we're starting to spin up these new activities, we have to be very careful about messaging to publics that are going to very rightfully defend their rights to freedom of speech. We shouldn't be, again, playing whack-a-troll or just responding to individual pieces of content. We have to think more about those systemic generational solutions. And that would be my criticism of the Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats. I'm not sure that this video will work, but I'll do my my impression of the video. It's a good visual for you at any rate. In the book, I go over the Dutch referendum on Ukraine's EU association agreement that happened in 2016. I thought it would be interesting to look at this specific incident because everybody's written about MH17 and, you know, the disinformation surrounding Euromaidan, but many people don't know that Russia was involved with this referendum. So essentially, after the Euromaidan revolution took place, Ukraine was pursuing its association agreement that had inspired the revolution to begin with. And all the EU countries had ratified the association agreement except for the Dutch. It was going up for a vote in parliament, and at the same time, there was a new amendment to the Dutch constitution that allowed anyone to call a referendum on anything that was happening in parliament at any time. And unfortunately, on the docket was poor old Ukraine and its association agreement. This essentially became a hot button issue for both the right and the left in the Netherlands, and Russia saw an opportunity to not only undermine EU cohesion, but also undermine international support for Ukraine and Ukraine's EU aspirations. And they launched an interesting multi-pronged campaign. They used Sputnik Netherlands, which is, of course, the state-run propaganda outlet, which would put out all sorts of information about Ukrainian corruption and cast doubt on the veracity of claims that Russia shot down MH17 or provided the missile that shot down MH17, which of course carried many Dutch citizens. They created this lovely YouTube video which purports to show the Azov Battalion, which is one of the more notorious kind of far-right battalions in Ukraine's armed forces. It was a volunteer battalion at the beginning and now has been slightly more integrated into the army. But essentially, these guys in the video threaten all Dutchmen. So they say something like, "Dear Dutchmen, do you not go about threatening Ukraine if you do not vote for association agreement? We will find you in movie theater, in public transport," and blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. Those are pretty much the exact words, but I encourage you to look up the video. This was quickly debunked by the Azov Battalion itself. Basically, they said, you know, these are airsoft weapons. Our guys would never hold weapons like this. This is Russia trying to, you know, pin this horrible threat onto us. Bellingcat, the open source investigators, also debunked the video and showed how screenshots that were shared from the Azov Battalion's Facebook page and YouTube were faked using Photoshop. But what's most interesting to me is the use of quote unquote fake Ukrainians at town hall meetings on basically the Dutch have a tradition of debating all of these things in public in their small towns, all these referenda and public issues that come up. And both of the campaigns that were campaigning against ratifying the association agreement had Russian citizens or Russians from the Donbass, or Ukrainians from the Donbass region, excuse me, where the war was going on, who had been living in the Netherlands or had come over from Russia. And they showed up at all of these meetings claiming to be Ukrainians when in fact they were either at this point Dutch citizens or Russian citizens, and talking about the corruption in Ukraine and how not everyone in Ukraine wanted the association agreement. Meanwhile, Ukraine tried to launch, a strategic communications campaign to counter all this messaging. But because of some bureaucratic stipulations in Dutch law, they weren't really able to make their presence known like these fake Ukrainians were. And they really think that this had an effect on the outcome of the vote. My colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called it a disaster for Ukraine. The guy who led the strategic communications campaign in Ukraine, toward the Netherlands, said that it was the biggest loss of his career. He's now foreign minister. And it's just recently come out that there may have been funding that exchanged hands between a Russian organized, government organized NGO and some of the political actors in the Netherlands who were part of the No campaign. In the end, the referendum did not go in Ukraine's favor, but Ukraine was able to find a diplomatic solution. But I bring up this example because there's often, especially in defense circles for some reason, this prevailing understanding that, we can fight disinformation if we have a compelling narrative. And Ukraine put together a compelling narrative for the Dutch population. But because Russia was really needling at those concerns of the Dutch population, they didn't want more EU expansion. They were very distrustful of Ukraine because of the war, because of the MH17 downing, and just distrustful of the EU in general. Russia was really able to kind of put this issue on the agenda and have it not go in Ukraine's favor, despite Ukraine's compelling narrative about how many Ukrainians were living in the Netherlands and what their contributions to society were. Ukraine is one of the largest, purchasers of Dutch tulips, for instance. This was something that was in the campaign, but it didn't matter. It wasn't able to undermine that Russian narrative, that compelling emotional narrative. And as a result, I think it's just important for all of us to think about, it's not just about telling a good story, right? We actually have to address the concerns that are being amplified and manipulated in order to fight disinformation. This is kind of bringing us up to date today. These examples aren't in my book, but I think it's important to talk about the trends that we're seeing in the disinformation space today. So this is from a takedown at the beginning of last year from Facebook. What we're seeing a lot of, not only in Ukraine, but here in the United States and in several other countries, is bad actors. And again, in this case, this is Russia, but it's not always Russia. They are now starting to imitate local news outlets, creating kind of a vector of information that people are more likely to trust because of the dearth of local news lately. These outlets are usually putting out, at least in Ukraine's case, targeting NATO and EU. They're targeting the Ukrainian government, saying that they're corrupt. And they usually are able to gain a pretty significant following, again, because of that trustworthy kind of local lens that they are approaching the issues with. And we're seeing this more and more here in the United States. It is something that I think people aren't really guarded against, because if something is local and homegrown, they are more likely to trust it. And we just need to teach people a little bit more about how to verify this information, look at where the links are pointing to, look at who is behind a page, encourage the platforms to create more transparency around all these things so that people can find that information out for themselves. All of this is extremely important. And some of this is happening through groups. So just a few weeks ago with another disinformation researcher, Cindy Otis, I had a piece in Wired called "Facebook Groups Are Destroying America." And I would actually make that much broader. I think Facebook groups are destroying democracy no matter where it exists. Basically, Facebook has incentivized people to join groups because they're saying that these are closed, private spaces. People want to connect with friends and family. They don't want to see content from brands on media outlets. But as a result, a lot of the nastiest content on Facebook has now moved into spaces that are closed, that have no oversight, and Facebook is incentivizing people to join these groups. So if you join one group that, for instance, to illustrate it with an example from the pandemic, I've been doing some research about anti-vaccination movements, and I joined an alternative health freedom group. Once I joined this group, in the panel on the right-hand side that had suggested groups, I was suggested to join a QAnon conspiracy group, a white supremacist group, and another false flag conspiracy theorist group, because that was what the algorithm suggested based on the group membership and my recent browsing activity. All of this is really just incentivizing this bad content to spread. It's incentivizing indoctrination and extremism. Facebook has recognized this. There was a Wall Street Journal investigation that happened, I think, at the beginning of June, just before this piece came out, that showed Facebook knew about this this use of extremism in these closed spaces on Facebook groups and neglected to do anything about it because it is what the business model is predicated on right now, that engagement and that outrage. So this is, again, a place where some of this local information is proliferating. I'll have a piece coming out in The Atlantic in hopefully a couple of days, but we'll see. COVID is slowing everything down, that looks at my own hometown and my home state of New Jersey and how local Facebook groups there that were clamoring for reopening of the economy and the state during the pandemic were vectors of conspiracy theories and disinformation. And I have some ideas about how we could change this, but again, I think this is an important thing to underline as we think about how disinformation is changing. It's not just about fake pages. Now bad actors, not only Russia, but domestic actors as well, know that this is where you find the most vulnerable people who are in groups like this. And you can seed a link there and it will amplify and proliferate across all of these groups. It's a very scary thing. Back to my cat. This is why we can't just have, whack a troll and rely on content moderation to find everything. Clearly that is not working, especially when it comes to these closed spaces. We just need more transparency so people can navigate the spaces, understand who is targeting them and why, and especially with advertising related to political issues, that is clearly very, very important. But we need to give them the tools they need to navigate this information environment. And that is clear from the case studies in my book, not only in Estonia, but Ukraine has also invested in media and digital literacy and civics. Of course, this is part of the Czech solution that I talked about, educating civil servants who might be targets of disinformation or cyber attacks about how their personal information can be used, about how they are conduits of information and they have a responsibility to the Czech citizens to, be responsible stewards of information. All of these things are important. Civics as a national security issue. So much of the disinformation in the 2016 election here was predicated on a lack of knowledge about how our political system, and in particular our primary election system, works. Some of that can be solved by educating people about, how important their voice is, how they participate in democracy. I think it's also really important to underline that we need to beware of homegrown vectors of disinformation. So whether that is people who are unwitting, like the protesters in front of the White House that I talked about before, or people who are more witting and entering into agreements to launder information. We just saw in March, I believe, the use of PR agencies in Africa that were targeting the United States, but basically doing the dirty work of the Internet Research Agency. We have to be on the lookout for this as well and recognize that there are a lot of vectors through which bad actors can launder information, and often doing that with homegrown vectors is the most attractive, because that gives them plausible deniability, and we as democratic societies are less likely to take action against that content because it is authentic and coming from, authentic local voices. And then finally, something that's extremely important, and again came through in the Czech example, also in my Polish example in the book, which I'm happy to talk about if anyone's interested in the Polish election that just went on. We can't fight disinformation when our leaders are using it on us, right? If we're concerned about foreign disinformation, we cannot cleave that off from the domestic disinformation problem, because so often they are one and the same. It is exploiting the same fissures. Often the same actors are being exploited. We really need our leaders to stand up and say, we're not going to stand for this. I'm not going to use it. I like to see politicians who are taking pledges not to use this stuff. And then we also have to create the regulatory structure to de-incentivize our politicians and political parties from engaging in this sorts of behavior, because right now it's open season, and the folks who are taking those pledges are, they're on the back foot, unfortunately. I always like to end with what you can do. This is a question I get a lot, especially when I'm in Germany and Austria. How do I vet my own information? I like to talk about lateral reading. So especially during times of crisis, if I see something that looks dubious and, my spidey sense is tingling, especially if you're getting emotional about content, that's a good indication that you should step back and do some of this. Checking the source to see if the source you're reading has contact information. Any reputable outlet, of course, will have a masthead. They will have contact information beyond a PO box or a contact us form on their website. It's going to have a real physical address and phone number. You should check to see if the author, the journalist, has published other pieces and whether they are reputable. Check the text itself. Often, especially on these more spammy type of websites, text will just be rote, copy and pasted. So you can grab some of the text and just drop it in Google and see if it comes up anywhere else. That's a good indication if you see an entire network of spammy looking sites, that this perhaps is not the best source of information. Everyone should learn how to do reverse image search, which is endemic on the Chrome browser, but there are also other tools you can use, including TinEye and a number of other tools. Basically, this allows you to see the first instance or similar images of any image on the web. And it is useful, especially in times of crisis, to see if an image is being misattributed. So just recently, when Florida beaches reopened, gosh, that was a long time ago, in April or so, we saw an image that people said was actually from California being shared around. If you did a reverse image search on that, you would come up with the original image from Getty, which showed that actually it was taken in Florida, not in California. And this kind of conspiracy theory about misattribution was incorrect. We've also seen here in Washington, every time we have a hurricane, there are photoshopped images of sharks swimming in the Potomac River. Reverse image search is a great way to debunk that as well. But particularly in times of crisis, it's a really good skill to have, and it's so easy. So I always like to teach people about that. And then in general, just practicing social media skepticism, recognizing that a Twitter account, even if it has 80,000 followers, might be an inauthentic account. Recognizing that just because you see a meme on Facebook or Twitter doesn't mean that it's true. It is not the gospel truth. I know all of you know this, but these are some tools you can help equip those crazy aunts and uncles with as well. And then basic cyber hygiene is really, really important. Creating two-factor authentication and password managers is something that's really easy. Everyone can do it, and it just makes your information so much more secure. Your two-factor authentication will make it almost impossible to break into any of your personally identifiable information, whether that's your bank account or your email or social media. Most of those services have those endemic now. If you can set it up in a way that uses an app instead of a text message, that is even more secure. So I suggest you do that. And a password manager, there are so many good free password managers. It is the best way to make sure that nobody is breaking into your accounts. It will create and generate these passwords for you and keep them for you. So you only have to remember one at any given time, especially if you're traveling to any of the countries that are likely to be trying to get at your data, this is something I suggest everyone do. I always like to end with this quote, which is from Thomas Jefferson. Often we see people, especially in politically polarized environments, saying like, these people on the other side of the aisle, they shouldn't even, be able to vote. They don't know anything about what's going on, or, there's just too much information. How can we expect people to make informed decisions? And I think that is incumbent on us. And that's what this quote shows. If we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control through a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. These are old problems. They, require generational solutions, but we need to start investing in them now rather than squandering time, which is, I think, what unfortunately the United States has been doing over the past 4 years. So that is it for my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen now. And it is lovely to be with all of you. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Nina. Again, the book is How to Lose the Information War. You can see it on my screen there. Unfortunately, this is the time of the presentation where I would hold up the real copy, but because of COVID, unfortunately, the publishers have been tardy in sending it out, but it will be, according to the bookshop I rang up yesterday, it will be in bookshops by next month, or so they say. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. I know a lot of what you've had to say doesn't focus specifically on social media, which was quite a surprise for me, actually, because a lot of the discussion that centers on disinformation does concern social media. But I do want to circle back to social media quickly. You outlined very well how a lot of the regulatory measures that governments have taken towards Facebook have focused on the content rather than, for example, the algorithms and whatnot. I'm just wondering, are there any regulatory measures that states can take to look at that issue of targeting? Because it seems to me that that is a really, really important issue. And I know this myself. I mean, we use Facebook at the center, and I know that, if I wanted to, I could do some of the damage that you're suggesting. I mean, it's fairly easy to develop those abilities. I'm not saying that we do. So what I want to know is, I mean, obviously we live in democratic societies and we don't want to touch too heavily on free speech, but is there more that we can be doing with regulation in addressing those algorithm issues, if you like?
Yeah, I think there is a lot. The first thing that I think is really important is that democratic nations work together on this. We don't really have a coalition of the willing, as it were, right now. And that is creating a disincentive for the platforms to really respond to us, because if we're going to have this piecemeal regulation, they can kind of create piecemeal regimes. And that's what's happening. We see a different version of Facebook, at least in terms of the content, in Russia than we do in the United States. And now with GDPR in Europe, things look different in Europe as well. So my first recommendation would be that nations really get together and develop something that is going to be based in democratic values and human rights, and work and set an example for the rest of the world and try to adopt similar legislation everywhere. What that would look like is a bigger question. Again, I'm really hesitant to prescribe anything that has to do with content moderation or what is and is not the truth, is or should not be allowed. Instead, I think looking at the targeting issue and just pulling it back, I've seen a lot of people suggest that, you shouldn't be able to target an ad any more finely than you would be able to target a television commercial or a newspaper ad, rather than being able to target based on age and demographics and, what you walked by at lunch, what you ate for lunch, what you last searched, all of that kind of cross platform information that Facebook is harvesting on you. And these blockers are following you around the internet. For those that don't know, there are really kind of scary things happening. And if you don't use these ad blockers, that's why you see ads for, if you just search for shoes, why they come up on Facebook, right? I would like to see us pull back on those ad targeting measures. I think advertising obviously should still be allowed, but we need to be able to pull back on how finely targeted those ads are. So that would be an easier recommendation than just like disallowing advertising at all. We're seeing Facebook consider that ahead of the 2020 election, which Twitter has also pulled back on political ads. You know, there are disincentives for regulations that would just disallow ads, including the fact that challengers to Democratic candidates often use the social media ecosystem in order to gain traction. And they would be disallowed from doing that, and it would be very difficult for them to compete with an incumbent without that advertising. So we can't take it away entirely in democratic systems, but I'd like to see it pulled back a little bit, and I think that would be a good first step. Also, regular audits about how the algorithms are working. Right now, we have no transparency whatsoever about how and why things are recommended to us when they are. And I would especially like to see civil rights audits of those algorithms, because we know they've been used for discriminatory purposes in the past.
Okay, great. We have a question here about the notion of trust in various countries. So your graph showed that there were a number of countries, the United States was high on the list, where there's been a level of distrust as a result of disinformation. Tim Underwood writes or asks whether the relatively high level of trust, I guess, in China, Russia, and Turkey, whether that those levels of trust come from disinformation. And I'll bring in a question of my own here as well. I wonder, your book and talk, I guess, rightly so, focused on disinformation in the international sphere. I'm wondering to what extent Russia really practiced these practices, or really developed these practices on its own population first and then rolled them out internationally. If you could give us a bit of the history, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Yes, so I think that's a really astute observation from Tim. I think the reason the trust is so high is because of the lack of a diverse supply of information in all of those countries. You're absolutely right about Russia practicing its tactics on its domestic population first. In fact, the reason I became interested in disinformation was because when I worked at the National Democratic Institute on the Russia portfolio, we were getting hit with Russian propaganda about our work in Russia, our support of democratic activists in Russia. They said that we were CIA or color revolutionists, when in reality we were just doing trainings about, you know, election monitoring. And so that's when I became interested in it. But the Russian media apparatus, it uses the exact same tactics that the Internet Research Agency, that the GRU, and all of these, tools and vectors of disinformation are using on foreign audiences. And so before even, you know, my book looks at how it was all tested and auditioned in Central and Eastern Europe, before it even moved to the foreign realm, Russia was doing all of this on its own population. And a great book about this is Nothing is True and Everything is Possible by Peter Pomerantsev, who worked in television in Russia in the 90s. And he shows how, you know, basically narratives that contradict each other were happily, you know, amplified on state TV networks in order to kind of create this stupor in the population. You don't know what is true. Maybe something is true, maybe it's not. And if all of these things are simultaneously potentially true, who's not to say that what the Kremlin is saying is not true, right? All of that doubt, again, disengages the population, which is ultimately the goal, to subdue us. And certainly that is to some extent working in Russia, although there have been a lot of protests recently in response to the constitutional amendments there.
Great. So I know you're a Russia expert, obviously, and Russia is perhaps the model state when it comes to disinformation practices, I guess. But I wonder if you've focused on any other countries. For example, Zara Kimpton, who is our national vice president, asks, have you been looking at the disinformation being spread by the Chinese government? For example, when it tells its own citizens that Chinese people are not safe in Australia or something like that. Are there any other standout countries like China or other countries that are engaging in these practices? And are their practices different perhaps to what Russia is doing?
Sure. So definitely spend probably 98% of my time on Russia, but especially during the COVID crisis, I've been looking a little bit more at Chinese disinformation and how that has shifted during the pandemic. And I think the goals are different. So whereas Russia is trying to undermine the whole Western system, the Chinese disinformation is still very it's focused on ultimately the Chinese population. So they're looking to prop themselves up at home, to absolve themselves of responsibility for not, closing in on the virus sooner. They're looking to paint themselves as aid givers rather than aid receivers. We've seen this in Africa, especially where China has sent a lot of masks and PPE, but not without the underlying press conference and kind of spectacle that comes along with Chinese officials and African officials there on the tarmac greeting the plane. That was, a necessity for all of those countries to receive that PPE and those supplies. And we've seen kind of traditional soft power vectors used by the Chinese. So their official diplomatic accounts and official state-run media accounts very much echoing all of these narratives about, China as a savior, China as a responsible nation in responding to the coronavirus crisis. Very different than what we're seeing Russia doing, which is needling different nations' responses and again, trying to get at those fissures in society in order to provoke discontent and dismay. Different goals, I think, there. And I would say to some extent, we've seen China use fake accounts, but they don't do it in as organized or successful a way. We saw this in relation to the Hong Kong protests over the past several years. And it's just obvious that these accounts that they're spreading propaganda, they're not really having the desired effect on the local populations at whom they are targeted.
Okay, fantastic, or a fantastic answer at least. We've got a few minutes left, so let's go out on, I guess, what is sure to be a big question that you're going to be focused on this year, and it's again, it's a presidential election this year. What should we watch out for in the presidential election of 2020 in terms of disinformation? Can we say that anything has changed from 2016, or are there going to be new factors that we're going to have to watch out for?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we've increased the costs very much for anyone who's looking to interfere. In fact, the costs that we have imposed have been undermined by the president and his advisors, who are often courting folks like Vladimir Putin and, joking about foreign interference. I think once President Trump turned to Putin at a news conference and said, fake news, I know you've got a problem with that too. And they joked about it, which was a horrifying moment for me as a scholar of disinformation. So all of that good work is being undercut. We've not imposed costs and this stuff is cheap to begin with. So I don't think there's really any deterrent factor. So while the social media platforms have put some walls in place, those walls aren't very high. Bad actors can easily scale them if they want to. They can go under them into the creepy basement of social media that is, Facebook groups and encrypted messengers in order to seed and amplify messages there. I'm worried about that stuff, but I'm also worried about, domestic political polarization. There's not much that bad actors need to do to really increase the rancor in our current national discourse, and that's extremely worrisome for me. There's a couple of inflection points that I'm worried about. It's very likely that our results won't come as quickly as we are used to having them because we're going to have so many mail-in ballots. I hope that we will see our secretaries of state who run our elections in the federal system explaining to their local voters that, things are going to take longer this year. I hope the media are messaging about that as well. I hope to see some other parts of the federal government messaging about it so that people don't think of a delay as, something has gone wrong. We should be willing and ready to wait until perhaps the next morning, if not afternoon, to understand what the results are saying, and understand, you know, that there are probably actors out there who are trying to manipulate the infrastructure. Hopefully they won't be successful. But we shouldn't buy every narrative we hear about either a long line or a mishap with voting machines. This is going to be I think our real vulnerability. And if there's any doubt cast on the integrity of the election process, that's all you need for people not to buy the results. And that's a very scary thing. So again, I think this is about proactive strategic communication related to expectations around what the democratic process is going to look like this year. And hopefully that can counter any funny business, whether that's coming from inside or outside of the House.
Okay, that will be one to watch. Well, we're out of time, but it's been a fantastic session. I've really enjoyed listening to you speak about disinformation. The book, again, is How to Lose the Disinformation War. The author is Nina Jankowicz, and I thank you so much for being here, Nina. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you too, at home or at work or wherever you are. Remember, the Australian Institute of International Affairs is a membership organization. We're always looking for new members. If you want to join up, go to our website, internationalaffairs.org.au. Check on membership. If you want to check out our upcoming events, you can click on events, or you can watch them here now.